Today, obviously, there is no story bigger than the announcement of Vice President Harris's running mate, Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota. But also in the news for the last 2 weeks since Harris announced that she was running for president has been Zoom. And Zoom is back in a big way. Remember during COVID when the only way we could communicate was virtually, and we were on Zoom calls pretty much 24/7? Well, after the pandemic was not necessarily over, but after lots of restaurants and stores and office buildings reopened, people started meeting in public and in person, and they didn't have to rely so much on Zoom. Well, thanks to Kamala Harris, Zoom is back. You've probably heard of all these pro-Harris Zoom calls that have popped up just since July 21st. The first one on the night that Biden announced that he wasn't going to run again, more than 44,000 participants joined a Zoom call hosted by Win with Black Women. Now, that's an organization that came together just in 2020 to push for Kamala Harris as candidate during Biden's nominee when she was being vetted to be the vice president. Well, Win with Black Women showed up big time on July 1st, not only with 44,000 participants, but they raised $1.6 million for her new presidential campaign. Now, immediately after, many more identity and interest groups started logging onto Zoom on behalf of Kamala Harris. Win with Black Men had a call on July 22nd. White women answer the call soon after had their own call. They had over, I was quoting 136, now I'm hearing 164,000. Yes, 164,000, a record-breaking capacity that caused the conference, the Zoom conference, and the donation platforms to crash multiple times. Then after the white women was the celebrity pack White Dudes for Harris. Just this past week, we've seen that group being suspended from Elon Musk's his platform X, but more calls have occurred. Elon Musk and his actions haven't deterred folks. We've seen South Asian Women for Harris, Labor for Harris, even Deadheads for Kamala, Rural Americans for Harris, Cat Ladies for Kamala. And I don't think there's any letting up because seemingly every day I get an invitation for a Zoom meeting, to get on a Zoom call with like-minded people to hear what others have to say about why they are supporting Kamala Harris. I suspect that now we know who her VP candidate is. We are going to see all kinds of Zoom calls that get organized pretty quickly to support the new Harris-Walz ticket. Well, in this hour, Annie Andrews, the co-organizer of that uber successful call, White Women for Harris, she is joining me in this hour. She is the CEO and founder of a political PAC called Their Future, Our Vote. She is a pediatrician by training. She once ran for Congress, but she's very concerned about the future of this country, particularly for our young people. So rather than sit around and whine and complain and wonder, Annie Andrews is out on the front lines, taking action, organizing women, raising money, and ensuring that our future is secure for the next generation. Joining Annie in this hour is Professor Andra Gillespie. She is an associate professor, Department of Political Science at Emory University. I wanted to have a political scientist join Annie because I want to talk about this Zoom explosion that we are seeing. Is this the new way that folks will gather, like-minded folks? Is this going to replace the ground game that is so critical to winning an election? You know, where you go door to door, where you get on a call and you call people, sometimes in your own state, sometimes in other states. Just what should we expect as we go forward with the excitement and the momentum of this Harris and Walz campaign? Are folks going to make virtually meeting the new way that we do politics in this country? Thanks to both of you for joining me. First, Annie, I keep hearing these different numbers about this call. I was first told it was 136,000. I'm on an article now on my phone that says it was 164,000 people on this White Women Answer the Call Zoom. So what is the actual number of folks that joined this historic call?
Yeah, we had about 164,000 registrants. And as we started the call, we saw the Zoom room fill up, got right up to that 100K number, which was their max. And so that we spilled over to the live stream. It was really an incredible thing to be a part of. And of course, you already mentioned this, but we were just following in the footsteps of the Win with Black Women and the Win with Black Men calls. We finally decided to get off the sidelines and stand shoulder to shoulder with Black women who have been doing this organizing for decades. And the call really felt like a reckoning and a call to action for white women to start organizing and voting in a way that benefits all women. So it's really an incredible thing to be a part of.
So I got the invite for the Win with Black Women, the Win with Black Men. I get an invite, I think, every day for one of these Zoom calls. But how do you get 164,000? Now, the Win with Black Women, obviously phenomenally successful. 44,000 is the number I think that they had. I think the Black men said they had 53,000 or so registered. The white dudes, I know they exceeded 100,000, but 164,000. I'm just trying to wrap my brain around what kind of organizing it took to get that many people to join this call.
Well, it's been a long time coming. We are decades behind in getting off the sidelines. I think the reason we saw the response we did is because who is running for president? It's because of Vice President Kamala Harris and the energy that her campaign to this day has inspired across the country amongst all demographics. And, you know, Shannon Watts was the leader of organizing this call. She and I have been friends for quite some time because I am also a Moms Demand Action volunteer and a gun violence prevention advocate. And it was her call to action. And I was privileged to work alongside her and two other women, Liz Minnella and Erin Gallagher. We spent 72 hours essentially nonstop organizing. I don't think I left my couch for those 3 days. And the response was incredible. And I think it speaks to, you know, just the inspiring campaign of Kamala Harris, as well as how down and out the Democratic Party was in those weeks leading up to the decision of Joe Biden to step aside. I think we all thought worst case scenario was going to happen in November and Trump, Vance, and Project 2025 were going to be victorious. And then all of a sudden, sort of out of nowhere, we had this resurgence of energy in our party, and the unity behind Vice President Harris has been remarkable. And, you know, white women feel that too. And things are different for white women now. You know, Roe fell since the last time we had a presidential election. And so things are really real. And I'm so grateful to see more women like me get off the sidelines and understand that we have a role to play in preserving our democracy and restoring women's reproductive freedom and addressing gun violence and all of the other issues that affect us.
So I wasn't on the call, Annie, but I'm good friends with a woman who was on the call, and she gave me some insights into what was said. These calls are long. Let me just be clear. These aren't like pop on 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Some of these calls are in excess of 3 hours. This is a woman who is South Asian. You know, she's an Indian woman. And she was struck by what she said. I'm going to use the word confessions. I'm going to use, openly honest comments that were made by some of the white women about how they had not been there for Black women in other instances. Talk to us some about, you know, how these almost sounded like what she was reporting is like a therapy session, you know, not a political action call. So talk about what some of the themes were and what some of the people talked about.
I think that's an excellent description of what the dynamic was. And while we were planning the call, we were very conscientious of what this needed to feel like and what this needed to be about. It wasn't, look at us, we're so special, us white women finally organizing. It's in direct response to what we saw Black women do. We did it in consultation with the leaders of Win with Black Women and Joteka Edie. And we knew that it needed to be about the candidate, not about us. But to inspire other white women, we had to talk about what the deal was. I wrote an article on my Substack several weeks ago called The Problem with White Women. And I got a lot of pushback, but we have to accept that we are part of the problem electorally. If white women voted in the way that we should, that is in our best interest, Donald Trump never would have been president. Roe never would have fell. Gun violence would not be the leading cause of death for children in this country. We would not have a climate crisis. white women are the problem. And the good news about that is we can become part of the solution if we decide to do so. And so that was the spirit of the call. It was, we are decades behind where we should be as a demographic. This was our time to organize together. It was a space for white women. Of course, all were welcome, but this wasn't to bring in Black leaders so they could teach us what to do. This was us essentially, excuse my language, getting our shit together so that then we could stand shoulder to shoulder with Black women in these 3 months leading up to the election. And so that's exactly what we accomplished. This is not a new white women's organization. This was us organizing together, and now we're taking it and running with it.
What pushback did you get on this article? I haven't read your article. I'd love to get a link to it, but what was the pushback that you got on the article you just referenced?
I mean, essentially that it was reverse racism, that it's not about race, that it's, you know, we can't, it will make white women feel bad about themselves if we call this out. But that's exactly what we need to do. It's the same reason that we decided to name the call White Women for Kamala Harris. And I got pushback from elected members of Congress, white elected members of Congress, about calling that, thinking that it would put white women on the defensive. Well, you know what? Like, we need to be on the defensive because that uncomfortable feeling is what we need to feel before we're ready to do the hard work to right this ship.
Let me have you jump in, Professor. You are a political scientist, and I wanted you today because you can give us some context. First of all, what's your reaction to what you heard Annie say as to what they wanted the tone and the content of this call to be? Not just talking about organizing, but really having a come to Jesus moment of sorts, is what we would call it in the Black community, about where white women have been in the past and where they need to be today.
I appreciate the perspective, and I appreciate the intentionality and the thought that went into, taking ownership of the ways that Black women in particular have been articulating concern about the American state, and taking responsibility to be partners in actually working together to try to achieve societal change. There are often memes and tropes in Black communities about Black women kind of carrying politics forward and serving as the moral conscience of the nation. But it's not healthy for one group of people to sort of take that responsibility or to even feel that they have to have that responsibility. This is a shared responsibility. And so what I hear in Dr. Andrews' comments is that she was stepping up and organizing within her sphere so that they could help share the load and take the sort of collective civic responsibility we have to be full participants in a very, very important and pivotal election.
So we know, and both of you are very astute, so you know that there is often tension in relationships between Black women and white women. Black women feeling, as you just said, Professor, that we are often asked to carry the party, carry the load, feeling like we can't trust white women, Annie, that oftentimes white women let us down. We saw that after George Floyd's murder. There were, lots of what people now call performative actions around addressing systemic racism, around, addressing the horrors of police brutality and how it impacts Black communities in particular. And then this feeling that, that it was fleeting, that it wasn't real, it wasn't genuine, it wasn't authentic. And just this kind of, and you'll hear Black women say this, I'll believe it when I see it. If these white women would vote in their best interest and not just vote the economics of their husbands, we wouldn't have the issue that we have now. We would have had Hillary Clinton. Let's go back to Hillary Clinton in 2016. So there's a lot of distrust, I guess, is my point. And Annie, do you think there was anything said in this call that starts to help to rebuild some of that trust that I think has been lost over the last, decade, if not longer?
Yes, I think we have work to do to earn that trust, because that word performative is exactly what so much of this activism has been. And our goal was to start to rebuild that trust. And as soon as that call ended, the four of us got on Twitter, started to see what people were saying. And there were Black women who attended the call. And from what I saw, it was a lot of very positive, encouraging comments. People very justifiably saying, I didn't know what I was getting into, but these women are for real. They got the business done. I mean, we raised $11 million. We should continue to raise as much as we possibly can. But I believe that, you mentioned intentionality. The intention was there. I think the execution was there, but that was one night. Yes, we raised a lot of money, but there is obviously ongoing organizing happening. Now Shannon Watts, together with some Black female leaders, are starting Women Wednesday calls. So every Wednesday starting tomorrow, between now and the election, are going to be continued calls to help these women organize together, to give them the tools that they need to contribute to campaigns, to knock doors, to have conversations with their neighbors and friends. So I am a glass half full person, but I really think that things have shifted. And, I think we really owe it to Vice President Harris and the way her campaign got off the ground, that is, it inspired this coalition forming and this come to Jesus moment. That's what it was for white women collectively. And I hope that things are going to be different moving forward.
And what do you think, Professor, on this issue of trust and building that trust and the letdown that Black women often feel when it comes to white women, feeling as if there should be so much synergy, right? So much solidarity on things like abortion rights, on things like a quality education for our children. But then hearing, like in the election of Hillary Clinton, that white women didn't show up in the way that we had expected, or hearing in the election, the flip side of that is hearing the number of white women that voted for Donald Trump, and pundits saying that oftentimes white women vote with their husbands and then say, I'll do charity in the office. If I'll keep my palatial estate, I'll keep my lifestyle, my wealthy lifestyle, and then I'll donate money to charity, or I'll donate my time to help, kids in foster care, or to help, kids who need free lunches. Professor Gillespie, we're talking about this distrust that has developed between white women voters and Black women voters. And Annie talked about her belief that this call and future calls that are going to be done on Wednesday nights between Shannon Watts and the Win with Black Women and other organizing efforts, she sees it as a good starting place to build that trust. What do you think is going to take for Black women to start feeling like white women are indeed allies in more than a performative way?
Well, I would argue that there probably needs to be a more pragmatic approach. So I appreciate Annie's comments that this was a start, and her goal and her aspiration is to kind of keep it up and to demonstrate over time with continued action, right, that her organization is trustworthy. That's probably the best way to do that. So there's still going to be people who are going to be skeptical, who are going to be mistrustful, and that's going to extend well beyond the election. But for those who are trying to organize for Kamala Harris, the election is at hand. And so you work with who you have until people prove themselves to be untrustworthy. So I think that lots of steps can be made, but I think you can still proceed even if people are still testing the waters and still getting to know each other. If there's one thing that I could add kind of based on your previous comments, I think that we need to have some realistic expectations for how we expect white women as a whole to behave in this election cycle. Gender doesn't operate in the same way that race does. Especially in terms of predicting voting behavior. And women today, I wouldn't necessarily characterize white women Republicans as voting for their husband's interests. I would argue they're voting their own interests, and they're voting their partisan interests. And so I think we have to be really, I think we have to be mindful of the fact that party usually does not, gender doesn't trump party. And so we're not going to see Republican women defecting to vote for Kamala Harris because there's a partisan boundary there. There are differences in terms of values and policy preferences, and things that look to Democratic women to be no-brainers might actually be non-negotiables for them. And so people are going to make those types of decisions. And I think we have to respect that and understand where they're coming from. We could talk about the underlying reasons for that and why they may be rooted in some misconceptions and even some prejudices. But I think we just have to sort of acknowledge that and also understand that there just is there are many different ways to be Black in America. There are also many different ways to be white and to be white women in America. And so I think I think what Annie and her group are trying to do is to find like-minded people and to make sure that they show up, that they work alongside, that they put in the sweat equity, and then also that they don't sit on the sidelines and not vote, because that would be fatal to a Harris campaign.
I hear what you're saying, Professor, but I guess inherent in what Annie is saying, and the women on this call is saying, is that there were white women who don't consider themselves Republicans who did either vote for Donald Trump or didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And it wasn't because they are fundamentally identified as Republicans. Is that your sense, Annie? Is that the white women that your group and groups like yours are reaching out to are women who aren't staunchly identified as Republicans, but they may vote Republican because their husbands or, they see it in their best interest, because for a lot of women, their best interest is still tied to their husband?
Yeah, I ran for Congress in South Carolina's 1st District, which has a lot of predominantly white, affluent suburbs. And I saw this phenomenon over the course of my campaign where these white women who are affluent would come to my events. They say they've never come to a political event before. They've never felt tied to politics. They didn't feel like the messaging spoke to them. And of course, that speaks of their privilege, that they didn't feel like they had to dial in at all. But the way, as a pediatrician, the way I would talk about issues from the perspective of children, about gun violence, about climate change, about women's reproductive freedom, about our public education system and access to affordable healthcare, all of a sudden they were like, oh, I believe in all those things too. So why do I vote for Republicans, or why do I consider myself an independent? And I say this all the time. I truly believe that this is a failure on behalf of the Democratic Party from a messaging standpoint, because we lack a cohesive message to tell voters that the Democrats are the party of family values. The Democrats are the party for kids. It could not be more clear. If you compare Vice President Harris's record to Donald Trump's record to what J.D. Vance is saying, he told his 7-year-old to shut the hell up. That is verbal abuse. So the Democrats are outstanding on the issue of children. And from where I sit, if you talk about politics in a way that ties it directly to our children, you can get women who identify as moderates or independents on either side to move left. But we have to have a cohesive messaging strategy. And that is the work that I do every single day.
So in this call and in other calls, I guess I'm just trying to understand, based on what the professor said, Professor Gillespie said, is, is the goal to get Republican women to start thinking in terms of, as you said, family values and the presidential ticket that's going to do the most for children? Or are you really just trying to speak to Democratic voters who perhaps weren't going to vote? Maybe they felt, uninspired by Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. I'm just trying to understand, are you trying to break through and get folks over from on the Republican side to vote Democratic? Or are you really just trying to drive voter turnout amongst Democratic women?
I think it's both. The long game, of course, is to develop a cohesive messaging strategy that appeals to moderate or right-leaning white women. But the short game is for white women to do everything into their power to tap into their social networks, use their financial capital, because white women will listen to other white women. White women have access to other white women. And yes, I've always voted Democrat, but I know people in my daily life that haven't. And so my job is to have one-on-one relational organizing conversations with those women. And I think when you start to say that, white women who have always voted Democrat understand that they have a role to play that is bigger than their one single vote.
Mm-hmm. Professor, let's talk about how these calls are coming together and what they mean from a political standpoint. As a political scientist, what do you make of the ability to get 164,000 people on a call, or 44,000 people, or 50? I mean, some of these numbers are just astronomical. How is this going to transform permanently the way we think of organizing around political campaigns?
Well, this speaks to the power of networks, and this has been going on before, but I think just the way that this happened so quickly is what makes this so unique. People learned how to do this, especially during COVID. I think that this is just going to add to, I guess, the quiver of arrows that people can use. And this is a precursor to mobilization. So you still have to do the door-to-door, you still have to make the phone calls, but this is where you organize the people who are going to do that kind of stuff. And so this is a lot easier and a more efficient way of doing it than having to have a bunch of multiple coffee clutches or a bunch of rubber chicken dinners. Those things are still going to happen, but this is now something that you can use to organize a lot of people and actually also identify people who might not be the type of people who go to monthly Democratic, county meetings or other types of things. Now, you know that you have this wider set of people. And if you can get them on a call for a couple of hours, you can get them excited and then get their names and their contact information to plug them in to say, hey, can you go knock on doors in this neighborhood this weekend? Or here's a list of phone numbers. Can you call these people to get them to turn people out to vote? That stuff is what is actually going to matter on election day. But in order to get the personnel to do that, you're going to have conversations like this. And this is now an efficient way to be able to reach out to those people.
Annie, what do you say to those that say these calls are just another manifestation of elitism, Democratic elites getting together with actresses and celebrities, elected officials coming, and now there seems to be this kind of mad rush in terms of who's on your call? I saw some of the flyers for some of these calls, and they did look like a who's who of the Oscars or who's who of the Emmy Awards. What do you say to those everyday voters who feel like there's a certain privilege associated with even being able to get on a 3-hour Zoom call, and they do have this air of being all about who can nab the A-list celebrity or the most A-list celebrities to be on their call? Annie, I'm just curious. Obviously, lots of excitement about these Zoom calls. A lot of people have participated. Obviously, 164,000 on the white women's call, 44,000 on Black women. There's been Latinas for Harris. There's been Asian women for Harris. There have been guys, white dudes. But there are some people who feel like these are, just another way for the elite Democrats to come together with their celebrity lineup of special guests. What do you say to those folks who feel like this, again, is not something that speaks to a lot of everyday women who have to work, can't be on a call for 3 hours, may not even have access to a computer or broadband internet?
I think that's a really great point. There are plenty of women where I live in South Carolina, in rural South Carolina, who don't have access to broadband. And it is a privilege to be able to get on these calls. And interestingly, when we first started planning the white women's call, we were really steering clear of celebrities. And then we got advice from other women who had planned other calls. And they said, you know what? It's the celebrities that get the butts in the seats. It's the celebrities that draw the crowds. And as a former candidate, I know that the value is in getting warm bodies in the door, getting dollars in the bank, and getting email addresses and cell phone numbers in the campaign database. And so in that way, we can utilize what we have access to, which is these celebrities that excite people who maybe wouldn't be excited to get on a 3-hour call that was just full of politicians. We get them there, then we get their money, and we get their email address and their cell phone number, and then mission accomplished for that call. But I also like what the professor said about these calls are just a precursor to the mobilization. And we need the funds in the campaign to pay the ground game, to pay for a broad sweeping comprehensive field program for Vice President Harris. And that's how I see it. And I also always talk to other doctors, to other affluent white women, that we are not too good to knock on doors, to sign up for phone banking and text banking. I was a candidate in 2022, but in 2020, every Saturday in the 6 weeks or 8 weeks before the election, I spent 2 hours phone banking for a local candidate, in addition to all the other work I did on campaigns. We are not too good to do that work. And we have to dispel that myth or that belief that somehow we're too busy or we're too good to put in the sweat equity and to put on our running shoes and walk down the street and knock those doors. So I hope that the energy we saw in the white women call will translate into that mobilization. And we're going to try as hard as we can to give women the tools to do that through these Women Wednesday calls we're going to be having between now and the campaign, in the election.
What do you make of that critique, Professor? I hear what Annie is saying about celebrities. I live in Los Angeles, so celebrities are everywhere in LA. But there is a certain critique of the Democratic Party, and in some ways, Tim Walz being selected is to try to counter that narrative that no, we're not a party of elites, of coastal elites. But when you do add celebrities to anything, it changes the dynamics. I hear what Andy is saying about butts and seats, and obviously that's important. But as a person that lives in Hollywood, I can tell you there is a certain dynamic that happens when you get celebrities involved in any event. And it's not necessarily bad, but it's a reality. What do you think about the use of celebrities and how they may either positively or could negatively impact this form of organizing?
So empirically speaking, people have looked at the effects of rallies on vote share and other kinds of things. And rallies are neutral. They usually don't have the effect that you would think on voting, which is why it's actually important for us to remember that it's retail politicking, it is canvassing, it is phone banking, it is text messages that actually does increase voter turnout. But I need to have people to do that. So if you don't have the personnel to knock on those doors, then you can't effectively increase voter turnout. And if somebody is going to be drawn to a Zoom call where they might get to see their favorite celebrity kind of talking as a real person and not necessarily talking in the really glossy Hollywood kind of way about their favorite candidate, then as Annie has said, you can get their phone number, you can get their text message, you can reach out to them to actually get them to go do the hard work that's actually going to increase voter turnout. So this is just creating incentives. I mean, I think the other thing that's important is the proof is in the pudding of the effectiveness of this strategy when we look at how much money was raised on these calls and how that contributed to Vice President Harris's fundraising haul in the first 2 weeks of her campaign. So people are putting their money where their mouth is, right? A lot of these are, there are going to be some big donors who might have maxed out on those calls, but there are probably a lot of small dollar donations, a lot of first-time donations. So people are always going to have the critique of Democrats being too tied to Hollywood and too tied to what's glitzy and glib. But at the same time, right, if you look at the number of people who are on these calls and the amount of money that was donated, this seems like actually a more democratic way of doing it than, say, having a big glitzy sort of event in New York or Los Angeles with George Clooney or Stephen Colbert that cost thousands of dollars to get into. It didn't cost thousands of dollars to get on any of these calls. And you weren't actually obligated to give money to get on any of these calls. So, I think you kind of have to take that for what it's worth and do understand that this got access to more people than some of the other traditional brick and mortar events.
Okay, and I take that, well taken. But what would you say to Annie and anyone else that's organizing these calls if their goal is, again, to reach those voters who are hard to reach, what we sometimes refer to as low propensity voters, and particularly those voters in the Midwest and rural areas? I know, Annie, you said you ran in South Carolina, I believe. What excites those voters, Annie? What makes them excited? Is it that one-on-one communication? Is it being on a call with Pink or, an actress? Like, what's going to really motivate those voters? Because what I've been saying about this election as a civil rights lawyer is if the goal is to win, we got to win big, because we know Trump and MAGA Republicans are not going away easily. They're going to use the court systems to try to challenge an election. And the bigger the win, the landslide win, the harder it becomes to challenge that in a court system, unfortunately, that is stacked with a lot of judges that have been appointed by Donald Trump, particularly all the way up to the Supreme Court. So winning is obviously the key for Democrats, but winning big, I think, should also be the goal. So how do you reach those quote unquote low propensity voters, those voters on the margin? Andy, are these calls the way, or is there some other way that needs to be employed?
I think the calls are the way to fund the strategies to reach low propensity voters. I do think that seeing a headline that there was a call with Glennon Doyle and Pink and 164,000 women might get some people's attention, but the call is going to fund the operation that will put the direct mail pieces in the low propensity voters' mailbox, that will fund the persuasive television ads that might reach some of these low propensity voters and will pay for the people, or pay for the operation, the infrastructure needed to get more people knocking doors. So I think it's a step before reaching the low propensity voters. I hear what you're saying, that sitting on a Zoom call, no low propensity voter was probably on that call or any of these other calls. But these calls, to me, are a mechanism to excite people about the candidate and the campaign, get people to give more than they probably ever have to a political candidate, and fund the operation that will be necessary to get out the vote and do whatever persuasion we need to do to really, like you said, win big this election season.
Real quickly, Annie, for those Wednesday calls that you told us about, for people who do want to participate in those calls, how can they get involved? How can they get information about those calls?
So really the best way is to follow Shannon Watts on Instagram or Twitter at Shannon R. Watts. She's posting about it nonstop. If you Google Women Wednesdays, these are co-sponsored by Indivisible. And the goal of these calls is not like the white women call. These are going to be, giving people tangible tools to use to contribute meaningfully to helping to elect Vice President Harris and Tim Walz. So these are going to be very effective, I think. Not a rah-rah session. These are going to be the real deal.
Strategy calls, how to do the work.
That's
Yes.
right.
We are out of time. I'm sorry, ladies. We are out of time. Thank you so much, though, for your insights. Again, congratulations, Annie, on that phenomenally successful Zoom organizing call. 164,000 women, $11 million raised. Keep up the good work. Keep engaging. Keep talking to white women. This is an election that we definitely can and should win. Thank you so much, Professor Gillespie, for joining us as well.